My name is Marilyn Smith, and for the past 3.5 years or so, I have been the CIO at MIT after a successful career in business and also leading IT organizations in financial services. And I've just recently left MIT, and I'm doing some exploration, looking for my next opportunity. So looking forward to being on the panel with you. Marco?
Great. So I was a member of the class of 2010 at Olin. I took a year off to do an education startup. So I was class of 2011. I'm currently a designer at edX, and I've gone through a number of education projects leading up to this as well. Right before edX, I was at Pearson at their incubated startup called Alley, which has since shuttered its doors recently, actually. But yeah, currently at edX.
I'll grab a mic then. Hello, everyone. I'm Colleen Wheeler. I'm from Wheaton College. I am a former K-12 teacher, so I will have that perspective. And I'm a trombone player, and it's International Trombone Week. So I thought I should tell you that.
Is there like a national trombone week?
I can get you involved.
No, I only play the radio.
Okay. Well, if you're interested, I'd be happy to talk later.
Ask the questions about trombone.
David.
Hi. I'm David Wedaman, and I work for Brandeis University, and I'm the director of outreach for our library IT organization. What that means is when we want to come up with some partnership with somebody, and we don't actually know what we're going to do with those people, I make it up and I convince people to do it, and I pass it off to people who actually do it.
So I thought I would start by going through the themes that we've heard since last evening and the 3 presentations that we've had, and the panel, Marco on the panel can add anything he would like to for these themes, because if you start stepping back and thinking about where we are, you can see some common themes that have been emerging. Last night we heard David Weinberger, who started out his talk by saying that innovation has been constrained by the inability of our previous media paper to scale. And the change in scale requires new assumptions. And basically what he was talking about is that we're redefining knowledge right now, and how we acquire knowledge and how we build knowledge through iteration and scale on the internet. And he talked a lot about links, and he presented a model which was referred to in the last presentation. So it's all about moving from paper to the internet, and it's all about crowdsourcing and links in order to build and acquire knowledge. And dialogue among people is really important, that don't always agree. And then there ended up being a discussion about, well, is there an absolute when it comes to knowledge, and on some knowledge there is, other knowledge there isn't, etc. So we got into some very interesting discussions. Then this morning, Katie Vale talked about edX and HarvardX, and a very interesting presentation on exactly what Harvard is doing to expand their educational offerings, both in their residential education, in their extended education, and also in what the work they're doing with edX and HarvardX around the MOOCs. So the common themes we heard, Katie summarized them very nicely at the end, were bridging silos productively through communications, appreciate what others are bringing to the table, advocating for collective success, and leading with the pedagogy, with the business, not with the technology, which I think is critical. Now, if you look at those two together, you can talk, you start realizing that it's all about networking and working together to build, to transform and build the educational institution of the future. And then Michael Cato talked about University of North Carolina at Charlotte just now, and he talked about creative ways that IT can add value while spending less, focusing on student support and infrastructure, and realizing how important it is to make investments in the network and other vehicles that help us to collaborate and work together. So you can see the themes start merging here. He talked about how the CIO needs to be much more tied to the mission of the institution, and Thornton asked, well, how clear is the mission of our institutions? Interesting question. And will our missions, I wrote down, will our missions evolve with the transformation of education? So transparency, openness, networking, and working together. And we wanted to talk a little bit today, and I'll turn it over to a couple of the other panelists, and then we can open it up for questions, about how IT can add value and what are the things that we need to focus on in order to know that we're going to be successful in this new world that isn't really, that's defining itself as we go. Anybody want to pipe in?
Shall we sit on these chairs?
I think sitting would be easier for the
Intention of
audience.
standing next to a chair, but not sitting, was killing me.
Well, we don't all agree, and
That's
we
what I
can
was
have a
just saying.
discussion about this.
That's right. I think you should start. 'Cause I was gonna.
Marco wants to start.
Marco's starting.
All right.
Go ahead, Marco.
In keeping with that theme of letting others do the work.
Is that a theme?
Perfect. There we go. It's on. So I've tried to think of ways that I could best describe edX in a way that was beyond its current form. I think it's really easy, and I mentioned this earlier, to see edX as a single source, a single LMS, a single CMS, a single repository of content. I think that will change in June when it's open source. Right? In July, you may see institutions decide to roll their own version of that platform and not call it edX and do something else with it. So I think that it's really easy to see edX as just in its current form. So my attempt to try and describe the broader picture would be to think about the things that have made an impact in education at scale, ideally global scale, in the last 100 years. And so the three things I would highlight are, and these are all things that you'll notice that people don't have completely positive opinions about, Scantron, Blackboard, and Khan Academy. So Scantron represents, in my mind, thinking about assessment at scale. So being able to assess really instantly a number of students. Now it comes with its set of clear downsides. Blackboard comes with this sort of idea of management, an LMS or a CMS layer that helps manage or administer the sort of educational process in some way. So Blackboard has plenty of people who do not like it. But the third category is Khan, who I think is representing the scale of content and actual learning material. And a lot of people love Khan, but a lot of people talk about, well, it's just another step in traditional education, blah, blah. So plenty of detractors, maybe less so for Khan and more so for Blackboard and Scantron. But interestingly enough, these three columns, I think, represent the three of the aspects that make up edX. It's content at scale, administration of that learning experience at scale via the platform, and it's assessment at scale. So it's curious that there's much less negative press, seemingly, about edX and MOOCs than there should be. It should be the fourth one and should get hit on or attacked as much. But I think that's the description I'll give for edX is just the next step of those three things combined. So I'm excited about what happens when those three are all being worked on in a distributed way.
Well, Colleen and I were talking a little bit before, and I'm actually not sure how my orientation totally fits into this, into IT's adding value, because I really don't think about IT, even though I work in the IT department. Where maybe it comes in as a complementary note, kind of like a harmony to a melody or something like that. But where I've increasingly looked for understanding how to go forward has been not towards IT, but into sort of the most human of the human things, into the way people talk to each other, work together, think about work, imagine what they're doing and how they talk about what they're doing and the interrelationships between people in the daily work and life is where I see most of the lessons for us as people and as a culture moving forwards. And I see IT will serve those things, but I think that's where it's all wrapped up in that, and those small, invisible layer of the human, what would you call it, network interface or something, on a daily basis where the human individual interacts with just the phenomena of life. That's where I think the interesting things come from. So I don't really think about IT at scale. I think about that first, and then where IT can come and help that and facilitate that and help us explore new ways to interact. Then I think it's really valuable. So I guess what I would say is perhaps the best value that IT's provided in my mind, and will continue to provide, is that it has forced us to change. It's changing the way that we talk to each other, and it's changing the way we act as a society. And because it makes us think about how we talk to each other and how we act as a society. So now we can choose, right? We can choose the old way, the new way, or some other way. Now we're aware of what's happening, and that awareness might be the biggest benefit. That it's whether I decide to do a MOOC or not, I know that I can do a MOOC, right? 20 years ago, I didn't know there was any option but to sit in the class and fall asleep in the back of the room, right? Now I know there's a lot of options, and I'm hyper aware of what those options are and myself in the moment in the classroom, and that's a good thing. How's that?
That's great. So I'll tell you a little story, and I may have told this to a few of you before, but I think it's important because for me, I think IT has cleared the way a little bit to have a conversation about learning. And just because we can measure clicks, for example, doesn't mean we understand what learning is. And it doesn't mean that that's what we really should be focused on. So here's a little scene from my classroom. When I was teaching music a while back, I had some stuff happening in my classroom that I thought was very cool. And the kids were so engaged. People were working on composing pieces for one another. They were working on performing things for one another. They were writing papers. They were interacting with composers and performers virtually through a bulletin board system, because that's this was a junior senior high school in Cohasset. And we had one Macintosh, and we had phenomenal things happening in that classroom. So I was not standing in front of the room lecturing, which I'm fully capable of doing and enjoy. I was doing things very differently when my supervisor walked in for my evaluation. And I thought, this is great. We will have such a great conversation about this afterward. And he sat dutifully in the back of the room for a while, observing, and then got up after about 15 minutes and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "I'll come back when you're teaching." Which I know he meant very kindly, but the measures he was using for evaluating learning in my classroom were very different than the measures I was using. And as the person closest to those students and their process for engaging with the discipline I was representing, I thought my measures were spot on. There was a lot of piloting, there was a lot of iteration, there was a lot of risk-taking. It was a very safe environment, extremely supportive environment, and it had nothing to do with the way I was being evaluated as a teacher.
He could have pulled out his form, all that stuff that you were doing.
So he was looking for different things. So I guess I'm here sort of as the thorn in the side, maybe, as the person to say, let's be really careful now that IT has gone and kind of cleared the way for us to have conversations about what's most important in teaching and learning. Let's be careful that we're looking for the right stuff. And let's begin with the end in mind. So that's my little soapbox.
So with that, does anybody want to open up the dialogue from the floor? There are a number of different questions that have been raised just in this short discussion among the panelists. What do we measure and how do we measure?
Anybody but Thornton.
Go, Thornton.
I've been talking about MOOCs, and I think it's wonderful that you'd sort of portray those as the four transitions of basically of learning. What is the role of the learner in sculpting the MOOC? All right, because here it is. I got 100,000. I didn't hear once basically collaborative design in there. I mean, basically, what we've now done is automated our ability to basically bore people globally. I mean, with great, basically, so at scale. The only thing you're missing is STDs, and you got the whole university experience, right?
I'd like to take a crack at that and then open it up to others.
Not the STD part.
Not the STD part. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. Let me pick up on your point, the point you made earlier. I had the pleasure of attending a flipped classroom a couple of weeks ago, and I was blown away by everything you were saying. I would think what you were saying was a flipped classroom. How much more effort is going into this? Because what I saw was just so exciting in the most boring subject, I thought, which was circuit design. It was the University of Florida Engineering School. And we've been trying this, and it totally changes the experience. We're getting completely different rates in terms of people staying in rather than dropping out in engineering. But I couldn't get over it. And the whole idea of then giving them access to go figure that out, go get this, and then the interplay, and forcing them to communicate with each other about what they were doing, rather than just sitting there and listening to, this is a circuit and here is a resistor, and is more resource going into, not, with all due respect, I understand the MOOC, that's new to me, whatever the hell it is. But, when I look at something that really was so dramatically different, it was this flip thing. Now, what's being done there?
I'm just going to give a shot at it, and then I think we ought to ask others in the audience to talk about, or Marco to talk about the flip thing, because a lot of universities, MIT in particular, is experimenting with the flip classroom. That's what the MOOCs are all about. About in terms of on campus. So you have this massive online education, and you have these mini videos that are being put together, and then you have the experimentation with the residential education, where you're taking the videos, you're asking the students to go up, and the faculty chooses whether they're going to do this or not. Ask the students to watch them at home, and then do problem solving in the daytime. I still think it's experimental across all campuses, and I think this whole thing is experimental. So going back, combining your question with Thornton's question, I believe that students are having a lot of input into this via the bulletin boards and via the dialogue that's generated by some of these classes. Now, I think we have to keep the customers in mind while we're doing the design, but I know there's a lot of activity that's gone on, just like with your class, with the students of these various classes that's being taken into account for the second iteration that Katie mentioned in her talk.
You reminded me of something called the Maker Movement. Is anybody familiar with the Maker Movement? I think that's where it's happening. These are usually physical spaces that are set up. We have one at Wheaton that has fiber design, and we're doing circuit work with students. But it's basically they're starting from something that's meaningful for them, something that they want to create. And they are tapping into expertise in the community, whether it's a staff member, a faculty member, or another student, to make that happen. The Maker Movement is all over the world now, and so if you were to Google hackerspace, you would find this 3D printers are in there. There's all kinds of interesting stuff happening. But it's going on now. Libraries are getting interested in getting involved, and higher ed.
I could add one thing while you're taking the microphone over, and that's that I think the flipped classroom and Colleen's classroom, which is kind of a flip, she was doing flips in the classroom, is an example of what I was talking about. I mean, to get to that model, people were saying, look, what is the best use of our time, and how do people engage each other when they're really working well together and their minds are clicking and they're creative and they're a team, and what's it feel like? And does a classroom feel like this? Traditionally, no. So how do we get the classroom like that? Well, we make sure that all the people are prepared, and we throw them in there, and we say have a kind of a atelier model, a creative space, and let's see what happens. We've got an expert walking around, kind of guiding, like in an art class or something like that. That's kind of what I'm talking about. So to get to that area, you kind of come from, not from the IT side or from the system side or from the scalability side, you come from the human side. How do humans work well together and learn together, and how do they lead an enriched life? And you try to recreate that, I think.
Yeah, I had a question kind of building off of Thornton's and Bruce's earlier. It kind of was actually spurred with Katie's talk, because they were talking, well, you were talking predominantly about how you're going to scale into the future, right? And there was a great question you raised earlier too. And one thing I was thinking is, as you have this community that's growing and growing, and you have fewer and fewer resources to basically moderate the community, could you look at potentially leveraging experts? Or, you know, we have an internal idea competition and kind of innovation platform, and we have what we call serial submitters. In any community, right, you have people who are more actively involved than others, right, and are really the ones who are steering the whole ship. Could you consider, or has anyone actually done this, taking some of those relative experts and applying them as kind of, I don't want to call them the workhorses, but the people who can actually do some of the actual legwork for you, and then have a final reviewer who's ultimately the professor or someone else on the ground who can say, yes, check mark, you're right. Right? So leveraging the experiences of people who've gone through it in order to bring in newcomers, right?
I mean, at least as far as MOOCs are concerned, I think I'll try and address. There was like a string of questions, so I'm trying to like find out how to possibly bring them all together. But I guess the first thing I'll say is, I think really what most excites me as someone who cares about education and with regards to what MOOCs and edX is doing is a bit of what you're talking about with being able to make more human-centric feedback or learner-centric feedback actionable in the classroom or right away, right? So instead of relying on quantitative assessments 6 months after you've stopped having that student, or longitudinal studies, even worse, you actually can have in-the-moment observations adjust someone's experience. Now, we are very far from that, I will admit. We're still in the automation of the boring class lecture, perhaps for even a large swath of our current classes. That, to be fair, that's what's happening. I think the bite-sizedness of it and how quickly we can edit those has clearly been shown to be helpful for Khan and other people. The responsiveness we can have on the forum semester over semester, as an example to the forum case that you're describing, or sorry, to the dialogue case, there's a 15-year-old in Argentina, Mirmit, who runs 600, which is our computer programming, 602, which is our circuits class. Instructors make the content, but she runs it. On the forums, people will use sort of the Twitter designation of @staff, @Mirmit, right? Because they know, and she will make custom lessons and lectures based on the questions of all the people that come in. Like, it's phenomenal to see, you know, and she's a community TA, she's able to be a community TA, and we're not necessarily the best at identifying those algorithmically or sort of automatically, but you can see how, now that it's all there, the potential to do something like unlocking the potential of someone like Mirmit, who previously would have gone completely unnoticed, is right there. So on any dimension you choose to tackle what edX is working on, or MOOCs in general, not necessarily just edX, is tackling, I think it's about all these different verticals or diagonals or axes, whatever you want, all of them getting faster feedback cycles and more like actionable learner feedback cycles. So that was my attempt to.
Yeah, one of the things I didn't get to add about one of the ways we're also trying to get additional engagement is for our Ancient Greek Heroes class. I mean, this is a legendary class on campus. Just about everybody who graduates from Harvard College takes it just because it's a really wonderful faculty member. So there are hundreds of alumni. The Greek Heroes class with Professor Greg Naj. So there are literally hundreds of Harvard alumni have taken that. So we've actually now put a call out to those alumni to act as sort of a board of readers or as sort of volunteers to help with the discussion forums and to help sort of mentor the students who are taking this now in the MOOC format, and which is tremendous. I mean, the alumni love it because they're feeling more, you know, engaged with their alma mater, and the students are you know, being able to benefit from the experience of other faculty. I also wanted to follow up on what Dave said about sort of the human piece in the flipped classroom. MIT also originated something called TEAL, or Technology-Enabled Active Learning, and a lot of, when we say flipped classroom, we're really talking about the concept of active learning. And in that, it was, students would watch a lecture outside of class, but then when they came to class, they'd be split into sort of small groups of 3, and they would sort of work on a model of the experiment and work on their labs together, and so they would be forced to work in groups. And originally, this was extremely unpopular because the students thought that they were going to be able to show up to this large lecture and be anonymous and, and not have to really just sort of sit there and listen. And it took about 4 years for this model to kind of take off before the other people who took physics the old way up and graduated, before students would accept the fact, like, no, this is a class where you work, you have to get along with people. We had teaching assistants who taught them how to resolve conflicts in groups. We figured out, like, how to, had not to have sort of like 2 men and 1 woman in a group, because that was always a recipe for disaster. Just things like that. So you really do have to kind of finesse how the flipped classroom part works if you are going to be asking the students to be active in a classroom setting. And I think this is our next steps with some of our Harvard X and edX offerings, is helping other institutions adopt the materials that we're creating and figure out how best to use them on their own campuses.
So we've got a thought. So just to return to your question, and Katie, to build on yours, you were talking about like the community that supports the learning, might be bigger than or different than the classroom, and might be a mixture of students and teachers and outside people, and there might be this little core group that's sort of a semi-expertise thing that does some kind of a special role. And that made Colleen and me think of a guy named Etienne Wenger, who wrote a book with Bill Snyder called Communities of Practice, and these guys study communities that do the same thing, and they share their knowledge and they train each other, and these communities exist outside of any other organization. So like the main example that they used was the midwife community. Like, so before there was any organized medicine, and outside of the world of men, women had this wonderful, rich professional community where they had a way of training each other, and they had a body of knowledge that was massively complex and important, and they shared it with each other. And it ends up that there's rules for the way these communities work, and one of the rules is about 5% of the community runs the community. So it's like, and that you shift in and out of that 5%. There's a lot of lateral movement. That's another rule. Is that you can be on the fringe, or you can come in. People let you come and go. There's not the credential system is like a more of a dynamic sort of shifting thing instead of a yes or no, you're good or bad kind of thing. And you shift into like an expert role for a while, and then you shift out again. So you made me think of that when you say, can there be a few people that help run this thing? So, and maybe the point there is that in addition to thinking about the class and the MOOC as organizational structures, we should maybe be thinking about larger organizational structures, communities of practice that cohere out in the world, and the MOOC is a subset of, and that might make these things more valuable and more sustainable. Yeah, the interesting thing about the communities of practice is that they exist sort of against in contradistinction to the usual organizational structure. Because the only thing you can do, one of the rules you can't do with the community of practice is you can't tell them what to do. If you tell them what to do, you'll kill the community, or it'll just leave and do its own thing, right? So how you get them and how they overlap an organization that tells its its employees what to do is a complex dynamic. Because you need them for the knowledge sharing that they have, and the professionality that they have, and the expertise that they have, and the commitment and passion, right? But you can't actually tell them to do all that stuff. So you have to sort of have them and sort of hope that they do it, and indirect sort of suggestions and things.
Well, you can ask them. And you can ask them for help, like asking the alums for help, like asking the faculty if they want to actually contribute, do the flipped classroom themselves. And then it just starts and takes its own momentum from the network itself, which actually is all about complexity theory, and that's a whole another issue. But you get into these swarms and these communities, and they adopt certain behaviors, and I think that the understanding of why that happens is complexity theory and complexity systems. Go ahead.
I think something I would highlight from this discussion that I'm actually surprised journalists haven't written about with regards to MOOCs already or yet. I don't think I've seen an article yet about it anyways. If you're a journalist, please don't jot this down. But MOOCs in general, I think, have a huge gaping deficiency in two specific areas. One is social. There is no sense of personal community of learners, who I am and my passions and interests and completely absent from Coursera, Udacity, you name it. Right? That only exists in a residential format and an in-person format. Frankly, there's more educational learner data on Facebook's profile of people and students than there is anywhere else, I think, collected and shared and viewable. And the second half of it is that edX and MOOCs in general are bound to a single device. I don't know that any of the platforms right now are responsibly designed, so none of them actually, some may work on iPad, tablet sort of things, but they don't work on mobile. I can't pull out my phone and start watching videos and do problems and quick assessments sort of on the go. So both in context as well as with other humans, the two things that you would expect to happen in communities do not exist in MOOCs right now.
So one of the questions I had for the edX folks has to do with the promise of adaptive learning and integrating the power of information technology into that process. And so I'm wondering if I'm going to use an analogy. So my son goes to Sylvan Learning, and what they do is they have their iPads and they sit in small groups, and the whole focus is on learning as opposed to credentialing. And there's one person who's at the table with the kids communicating via headset into someone who's controlling what kinds of tests get rendered on your computer. And it's individualized. So with all this talk about credentialing and the MOOCs, I'm wondering if that's diluting the primary focus, which is learning, and whether or not the platform and the information that's being gathered through it is ultimately going to be used to really demonstrate learning as opposed to completion and credentialing.
My quick note on that, and then I'll is that I think right now edX has a single goalpost that's tangible and obvious, and that's the certificate. But the reality is that there are tons of goalposts, and some of them have already come up here, that we could be designing for and actually having the platform better express. Or like instead of me wanting to get certification level or mastery level of the circuits course, I may just want to cross the basic TED awareness threshold, right? Just give me the 20, 30 minute, 1 hour exposure level, right? Or I might want to do like basic discovery or exploration. And that's like the top 20% of the videos and problems that give you a slice of the ideas, but also some actual practice and actual doing, right? Like some healthy balance. I don't know. Those are just example goalposts that you could see. You could also see, based on my interests, independent of what course they're in, allowing me to view on my mobile or wherever, just watch videos or clips, sort of a la TED sort of style, just engage people on what they're interested in. That doesn't exist yet, but obviously we'd love to move there.
Can you talk about badges yet? I mean, like smaller way to measure
we would, the answer I will give now is we would love to hold off on a lot of the incentive structures because it imposes a certain learning goal that you want. But like, if I said that, oh, we want you to be a level 2 commenter on the post, is that going to result in a 30% jump or 80% jump in comments, but half of them are rubbish? So we're being careful about being slow to that game a little bit.
Yeah, I'm thinking something different.
Yeah.
Skills-based badges. So not going through a complete course, but demonstrating some skill. So Mozilla has a digital badge, so which is just sort of a smaller, bite-sized chunk. right?
You know, a badge that like scouting badges, where there are particular things that you have to demonstrate that that you have learned. Sorry, I was just going to follow up on what Marco was saying about some of the personalization type work. So, I mean, I think that's another example where you can see that we're in two different organizations. So from the edX side versus me and the Harvard X side, we see it as not just sort of a MOOC experience, but we're looking at our education in different in our different sort of buckets there. So as an example, we have an upcoming course that's going to be sort of an architectural survey course. So again, it's being designed as a MOOC, but sort of for the world, but it also has sort of a second purpose, which is that our graduate school of design discovered that some students, or that students come from very different backgrounds to that particular school, and not all of them had the full sort of range of experience in architecture. So while they're doing this sort of as a MOOC for the world, they're also using this as self-study materials for the incoming students to make sure everybody's on the same page and is starting that graduate program kind of with that same benefit of having the same experience. So we can see us doing similar things where it may start as a MOOC and then come back to residential, or it starts as a residential course and goes into an extended, and so we really keep seeing this as kind of a a pressure diagram on all three of the types of learning that's happening at Harvard.
I'd just like to add, in terms of MIT, it's all about moving to hybrid or blended learning for the residential education, and how do you do that? And how do you make the students' experience better? I don't know how to measure it. I mean, I think that's something we can talk about. Maybe we can talk about at lunch, the models and the measurement. But it is all about using technology to have a hybrid learning experience and to enrich students' learning. And I think in the residential, it's all about how the students grow as people. It is not all about what they learn and what jobs they get, at least at many universities and at MIT and at Harvard and most other universities. So that's really important, how they grow as people. And I think that, at least at MIT, we believe that the hybrid education is going to help with that, because it'll allow people to work together in teams and to demonstrate their learning, and also to have the basic concepts presented online, which will be an easier way, and the students want it. Students are attending less classes. I don't know if we've discussed that yet, but they're not showing up for classes.
And have 12 years to graduate.
Well, that's true. And so if they can watch the videos and then have something that they will want to show up for the classes, I think it will be better. And I think that's happening across universities. I know there are universities that are videoing all their classes now. Michael.
So there were two threads that I've sort of been hearing, but also in talking to all of you, I've been hearing. One is the prerequisites, bringing people to a certain level. And I'm curious, I guess I have two related questions to that. One is there any data that actually shows that having the prerequisites make a difference? For example, I'm pretty sure Mirameet didn't have the prereqs, but she's running the program. And I'd love to know about that. The other thing is, similarly, I'm quite sure that there are social activities happening outside of the MOOCs that you guys have created. And I'm pretty sure they're self-selecting, and I'm pretty sure they're Google Plus or whatever. And I'd love to hear more about that, and I'd love to hear about, as part of that feedback loop, there's some mechanism for tying that separate parallel feedback into what you're doing educationally with the MOOCs. Because it seems like that's a really rich area, and I'm sure you guys are tapping it. I just would love to hear more about it.
So, as someone who when I joined edX, my primary project or goal was to be put on the social and the discussion and the forums team. It turns out that's because of the size of our team, we needed to focus on other more pressing scale issues, being able to author courses, but I would love to focus more time and energy onto the discussion piece. I think there's a ton of energy that exists outside the platform that is more indicative of the platform's lack of ability to respond to that richness. I think there are other tools that just fit different niches for dialogue better, so we're not going to be the one discussion or social platform to rule them all, certainly on the learning side, but there's a lot we could do. So That's really not actionable or not necessarily particularly profound, but I do think that we will, within the next 6 months, have that bandwidth to start pushing major changes on that front. So I am excited about that and what it could do, but no concrete plans at the moment.
There was a course in public health that we offered last year. It was in statistics in public health. So, not something that we necessarily thought was going to be a real barn burner, but still got 25,000 people worldwide kind of taking it. And we found people sort of self-organizing Facebook groups. There was actually a big meetup in, I think it was either Madras or Bangalore, India, that they got 100 people to come together to have that they organized themselves through meetup.com. And then we started thinking about, well, should we be actively trying to encourage people to do this? But as David was saying, it's like, that will probably kill it if we actually try to actively make these people get together. But but if they do it themselves, they'll be more engaged and they will, make it more of a priority to attend something like that. So that is something that we want to keep encouraging them to do. So.
Maybe to change it. Oh, is there a question over there? Yeah. While it's going over, I'll send my piece. So what Colleen and I do a lot of is we do a lot of professional development event designing, and we're kind of famous for designing events that are unusually engaging and disruptive to you as an attendee. And we like to make you feel uncomfortable and happy and crazy and wild, and we don't like to lecture and things like that. And one of the things we do is we have a really light structure. So there's a structure to the event, but we definitely program in things that are unstructured. So things that we don't actually know what's going to happen. And we have a kind of a sense that it should go in a particular way, but we're not that heavy-handed on the control, so we don't always know. And because we're both improvisational, we kind of fake like we meant it to happen when it goes off the rails, and we can bring it back in. But one of the things, I think the challenge to the online environment is how do you program those things in? An online environment can be a really good for a structured, tied down, where you are every step of the way. But if you want to let the rein, give your students some reins to sort of explore and play and go outside their comfort zone, and you don't know where they're going to go, that's tricky. But the social things, social activities, the meetups, that seems to be a place where you could accommodate some of that.
Yeah. I was thinking you were describing that meetup, or also the trailers that you were talking about earlier that were used to describe the courses. Wondered if you do something like that for the edX, because, boy, if you saw that, instead of having somebody have to go in and just read a little blurb about the course and then maybe opt out so you think they've enrolled but they haven't, have something that really gives them that meat and then maybe shows something about the meetups would be great. But that's just a thought. But I was actually wondering, as everybody was talking, about the single most positive things a participant has said about the course and maybe the least positive. Although I can imagine that maybe the least positive might be about that lack of identity and not feeling that you're part of something larger when you're taking this class. You're a little bit isolated. But I don't know, so I'm wondering about the most positive experience and what people say is really the least positive.
Yeah, the discussion forums are an unbelievable range on every perceivable dimension. There's people who self-select and form subgroups that are like only in one language. So there's parts of the forum that are completely unreadable, to me at least, because they're in Cyrillic or Russian or something. Really. So I don't know what's going on there, but it's there, and that's how they self-organize. There's people who write about how this single course transformed their life and set them on a whole different path. And at the same time, there's massive posts on the forum where people talk about how edX is doing nothing for the world and changing nothing, and it's a terrible experience for them as a student. They feel lost and isolated and alone. So there really is a full range, and I'm obviously not necessarily characterizing what there's more of, but it's all there, and different students will engage with different parts of it. But it's really the same thing you would expect from real classes, just not as more easily clearly defined. And I think that the one note I'll mention is I really do think that there's even too much emphasis on the pure online part of MOOCs, when I think the real potential benefit for within the next 3 years, 2 years, change is when it gets paired with residential. And what do you do with SPOCs, right, or small private online courses?
I'm just going to add one quick thing, if I may,
Go ahead.
Marilyn. So what I hear you saying is what I've seen certainly in the classroom and what I've noticed. I'm taking the MIT Creative Learning MOOC now. When some people, I think, just expect the MOOC experience to be magical and a totally different thing, and that knowledge will pour into their soul and there will be no effort. But it's the same thing that happens in the classroom. If you take personal responsibility for your learning, as you see many people do, maybe it's not going so well for them, but they step up, they get more out of it. So I think that part is consistent.
So one of the things, I'm going to get a little out there in a minute, just from something that you just said, that David said last night. He talked about how you start, you learn how to use the media that you have. And you start by doing, so when people started posting online, they started posting exactly as if they were writing articles in newspapers. There weren't any videos or anything. And then all of a sudden people think creatively. Well, we're starting by thinking about lectures and problems and experiences. And I think this is going to evolve. And I heard a fascinating, I don't know very much about it, but I've been talking to some friends who are kids about it, on gaming. And there's several MIT professors that are teaching how to program through gaming to high school students. They're doing a lot of research. And these games that are coming out now, this new game, BioShock, that's the third one out, I've got to go in and try it. And somebody told me to start with another one last night. We had this big discussion last night at dinner. But you can think about different ways to use this new media to learn in a different way, besides lectures and problems. And I think probably with all this experimentation that we're doing with the MOOCs and with any kind of online learning, not necessarily just MOOCs, we're probably going to evolve to new ways of learning. And somebody who called in, I'll just say one more thing, the NPR show, I heard Tom Ashbrook talking about this BioShock, the new game, said, well, are we going to learn like we did in the, what was the name of the movie now, the Matrix, about how we sit down and all of a sudden we know how to fly a plane after listening for but people are studying how our brains work too, and I think that gets back to how do we actually measure this and how do we actually know how we learn.
Well, coming back to, again, putting on my anthropology hat and also my futurist hat, I mean, one of the big issues why we're having this discussion is because there are those who would argue that the economic basis for higher education is no longer sustainable. It's just too expensive, type of thing. But then you have this MOOC thing going on, which is just spectacular. I mean, I'm so excited. I got to go out and smoke afterwards. I mean, because right now, a part of the way you do development is you got some rich guy being a unisexual term, has to put his or her name on a building. But now you're talking about MOOC meetups, right? Yep. That costs you nothing. But this MOOC meetup brought to you by Starbucks or by Panera or by this type, and it actually changes the entire commercial real estate environment. It changes the entire food and beverage business, right? I mean, brought to you by Joe's Bar and Grill. But there's a real opportunity for you to forgive me for again putting on that venal hat, but I come from a long line of robber barons, right? I can't help myself, right? But there's a real opportunity for you to basically say, "Hi, Hilton, how would you like to have?" As opposed to having a bunch of insurance salesmen, how would you like to have actually people thinking and playing in your spaces? I just think there's a real opportunity to bring these to bring multiple industries together to try to celebrate the fact that people are more than just meat sacks.
Isn't it going to be funny when the university president knocks on Joe's Bar and Grill, Joe's door, and says, "Hey, I want to talk business"? Joe's like,
I don't think we yet know how MOOC. I've thought, how are MOOCs, or how is it actually going to save the money? Because that was the initial drive, or one of the drivers behind this. So
I had one thought about games, if I may. Games have always amazed me. The recent generations games, not the ones that I used to play, but the recent generations of games have been so complex that they're these online environments, right? That they have this responsibility, a pedagogical responsibility that they do really well. They probably do better teaching than teachers teach, but the game has to teach you how to play itself fast, and it has to do it in a way that you find it to be fun and entertaining. So it has to take you through levels of itself that are meaningful and increasingly difficult to get you ready to play it so that you can enjoy it. So what is that? It's like a interwoven, self-aware, pedagogical, fun process, pre-game thing that it seems like we ought to learn a lot about. We could learn a lot about that in higher education, about how to, here's a class, inside of the class, that teaches how to take the class thing that's also fun in a game. And that could make everything we do better. The tradition. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that could,
the new games tell stories, and I think that telling the story is a big thing.
Yeah, I mean, so actually my senior capstone at Olin was for Autodesk, and we were looking to build a visual environment that helped you navigate through the learning of their professional software tools. And so much of the research in game mechanics, I mean, I don't actually like the term, even though I've done research in it, because it can be used as sort of a hokey thing, but I do think certain key things, and it gets overused maybe, but and I'll never get his name right. Michele,
you're right.
Flow, scaffold learning. Like, if you've played Plants vs. Zombie, which if you haven't, you should, you cannot lose that game in the first 10 minutes. It's impossible. Right? If you wanted to immediately lose and game over yourself, like in Mario, you can't. Right? It's just Plants vs. Zombies. It was like Game of the Year 2010 or something. Yeah. And you just learning is very cleanly scaffolded. Like, you can see each, like, level 1 is actually broken into like 7 different mini levels. You don't realize it because there's narrative in between it. Where you can't lose. Like, drop a seed here, or you're like defending your house, right? And like it's all done very, very well, and does represent that breakdown really cleanly, I think.
Okay, I got a couple of trains of thought here. The first one being is relation to games and education. Games, like you said, they want to make them fun to play. I think it's a way to look at education is how do we give the students the ability to win. They're not playing the game because they like to play the game. Well, they do. That's a side benefit. The real benefit is they get to win at something, and that's what they want to win at. So if there's a way to turn the education into some sort of sporting event where you can win, is some way to get more involvement in it. And then from the edX standpoint, you made a comment about learning. Was it Learning Center, Sylvan Learning Center, where they're focused on learning. And I'd be curious to see what the demographics are of the individuals who go into edX, because I'd be willing to bet, or just an assumption, that from a younger age standpoint, the parents want the students to learn, whereas the students in that particular instance, they want the credential. The parents want the kids to come out knowing stuff, as opposed to walking through life blind and dumb. And once you get beyond that age, a certain age, let's say it's 12th grade, now you've got this next demographic of between 18 and 25, where they are going from their parents wanting them to learn to now they want to learn, but now they want to get the credential. Now, once somebody's got that certain level of credential, you go above that and say, okay, am I going to learn for the sake of learning, or now am I going to learn for the sake of the credential on top of whatever I have? So if you've got, on edX, if you've got a lot of people between the ages of 18 and 25 signing up, that's going to give you one answer, whereas you've got between the ages of 25 and 50, where now life gets in the way, because now when you're between the ages of 25 and 50, you've got the kids, the house, the job, the mortgage, and all that other stuff. And how do you keep that group invested in their own education? So those are my 3 thoughts on the process so far.
I think one quick note I would mention about the demographics that surprised me are how many people are above the age of 35 on edX. So there.
People constantly age
every day. No. Just like career change, or like lifelong learners that want to engage in a subject completely different.
There's 7 of them, right? 7 old people on there.
I mean, it's not just students who are adding this on to their workload, right? Like, whereas if you look at India, if you look at our students from India, that demographic is very young. When you look, right, so in terms of the U.S., a lot of our learners in the U.S. actually, I don't remember if it's actually more than other demographics, but 35 to 50 is, I think, close to the largest. In India, it's 20 to 26. People who have added an MIT or Harvard course, they're current college students that all culturally have decided that they're all going to add one more course to their workload, and it's going to be a Harvard or MIT course, right? So it's like just interesting, like it does change.
I just wanted to follow up on the gaming concept of learning. Interesting stat I've been working with is 80% of all your time spent gaming is failing. Right? So 80% of the time you're failing, so how can that be fun? But then you think about it, and in the case of learning is, you have a safe place to fail, right? For that one shot. I say it all the time, I get that one shot in golf that gets me to come back the next day. But no, so you have a safe place to fail. You know, we were recently looking at our curriculum, how you do it, and I remember the angst I would have. School, I had one chance, and I better pass. I better pass. And then when you talk about adaptive learning and peer-to-peer and gaming and community and all that kind of stuff, you often would measure yourself against the person next to you, and did you get the same score, and did you do well? In games, you don't necessarily do that. Now, you have MMOs and where you work together, a whole different dynamic, but you spend a lot of time failing for that win, that epic win, if you will, for that feeling that you've accomplished something. So if you can emulate that in the game theory and gaming mechanics into the curriculum and learning, I think that's the challenge.
I'm so glad you brought that up. Right. Right. Yeah. And I was going to say that, so one of our courses, the CS50 course, is actually designed around an apprenticeship model, so that you're not comparing yourself to somebody who already has an extensive computer science background. Your grade, as in our on-campus version, your grade at the end of CS50 is compared to how you were at week 0 and then later at week 12. So we've worked really closely with the faculty teaching CS50 to try to match that apprenticeship model into the MOOC version of the course. That's also one of the reasons why we made it a 6-month course, that people give working people longer time to go through the material, so that work and family and kids and things might get in the way. But again, they're not being compared to other people taking the course. It's looking at where they started on the first day, and they will get a certificate if they can show that they've had an upward trajectory from that piece. But that's taken a lot of work, and again, it was very carefully designed pedagogically, and it's not just taking a sort of a lecture class and forcing that into into an existing technical framework.
But then do you have people gaming the game? I mean, similar to sales forces, right, where they lowball the number and they oh, look at that, they're failing.
Right.
I mean, they watch.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, basically.
We have another question from Bruce. So it's that mass personalization that we're trying to get at.
cases, I think, and I can't, I totally agree with you. I moved from corporate to academia, and I've been there about 4 years, and I've learned a lot about the power structure and academia. But I know that there's some surprise at MIT, and I believe there is at Harvard also, at how some of these faculty members are embracing this. I went to a couple of faculty meetings, and some of them are more aggressive sometimes at MIT than they are passive-aggressive, and some of them stood up and said, it's about time we did something like this. We're still teaching the way we taught in the 12th century or whatever. And so some of them are really embracing it. But how many are stepping up and have the skills to do the videos, to do the flipped classroom? Because clearly a lot of them got to start operating out of their comfort zone, not to mention the expertise issue, because we're talking about networking now, and we're talking about opening up everything. I will say that you have to keep in mind OCW, which you mentioned, which MIT has had. We had our 10th anniversary this year, and I believe it was 10 million people that have gone through various. So faculty at MIT, at least some of them were familiar with opening up and sharing with others. But I think that's a really good discussion point.
Let me make another outrageous statement. I don't question Harvard or MIT. I think you all are doing a fine job. Keep going. My own experience of traveling around the country is we're failing in the middle and the lower market in education, in higher ed. We are not providing education at a price point that students can afford, that gives them a return, that gives them a career, that allows them even to pay their student loans. So I'm not worried about the Harvards and the MITs. I'm worried about everything from the University of North Carolina, you know, at Charlotte, to these people I work with in the Midwest, out west. And what the heck can we do here? Do we just force these other models on them, or how do we, anybody got a clue on how you make this happen at scale? And I'm thinking a little bit about what David said last night about iteration. Yeah, when he was talking about iteration at scale, that to me is we have this entrepreneurial culture that I hate, which is I do one thing and then I go on and I do another startup and I do another startup and I make myself rich and I leave the world a poorer place. Otherwise I'm not known as a thief. But as opposed to I built this. Harvard's 375 years, right? Okay, Harvard didn't quit after go to another startup. He wasn't a serial startup guy, and we have too many of these serial startup guys. We don't, and all they do is line their own pockets. So.
I work at a public university, and I would suggest that our reward and incentive system is all messed up. Because if the goal for many is tenure, then the basis for being given that tenure is based on things that are oftentimes in conflict with being innovative, putting in the extra time to take a different approach to teaching. And not that these things are all bad, but the need to publish peer-reviewed articles or books and so forth, and all the other things that are placed on faculty in terms of service demands and committee participation, which you could argue a lot of that structurally could just be removed. But this sort of governance structure that's built into a lot of these institutions, just it's death by a thousand cuts, and if there were a different sort of structure put in place that did recognize and reward, especially in a public university, making what the public has paid for free to the public, then maybe we'd start to see some of the talent redirect some of their time and energy into these areas. It's interesting where I am, and I can't speak for everyone, but there's a lot more older faculty teaching online courses, trying different things, who are already tenured, and the new faculty coming in are sort of, well, where do I have to spend my time? Where is it going to be of most value? I'm trying to get a foothold on my career. how much do I have to do for research? How much do I have to do for service, publication? And they're feeling their way at a time when we could be sort of cultivating them and bringing them along to help them express their own innovative ideas, some of their own sort of approaches to teaching that incorporate technology. So I think that's kind of at the heart of it.
New creative model where we sort of blow up the whole model of universities. And that's going to take time because the people with the power are gonna resist it.
Two quick notes on two startups that I think are operating at the fringe that offer just a little bit window into the possibility of what, I don't know whether or not everything they're doing is right, I don't know. One is Minerva University, if you've heard of it. It's in San Francisco. The short version of their premise is that they'd like to have graduate students from big universities or hubs globally act as agents in a flipped classroom style course structure. So they can have professors in select places, but largely have a lot of graduate students being TAs in a more personalized setting. And all of the students, right now the idea is that they're doing a partner year, just like Olin did a partner year in this upcoming year. And they're trying to get around accreditation by partnering with the accredited university, but that's another discussion. But essentially their goal is to have dorms, essentially, or learning spaces globally, so as a student I could decide to study abroad by paying for my plane ticket next week to fly to Rio, and now be operating out of the Rio campus, and now be operating out of Tokyo, and sort of move around. So that's one case, and they're born in a MOOC world, and so the way they're going to handle things that are more traditional, tenure and other things, are going to be very different. And I imagine their costs, presuming they get some of the basics checked off, like accreditation and other things, will be substantially lower than the traditional model. The second example I'll give is actually technically not a public startup yet. It's in stealth mode in San Francisco, I believe. It's called Hackier. It's still going through the investment round cycles, but the idea is that they will not care about accreditation. They'll not care about any of the traditional things and benchmarks that anyone in academia is currently measuring. They don't care. What they're going to measure themselves off of is pure employment. And so their premise is that, at least in computer science, it is clear enough and actionable enough to measure your impact in a one-year program that they want to take graduating high school seniors who demonstrate a passion or interest in computer science, run them through a structured one-year program, which is essentially a lot of the pre-MOOCs that were doing cool learning stuff online were all CS-based. Or a lot of them were CS-based. So they've got a couple years worth of accumulated content that they want to sort of structure, put into a pipeline, and at the end of it, they measure their success based off of what the job placement, right? And they can do interesting things where they can have tuition be 10% of the income you make in the first 2 years, or like just sort of wacky things that you wouldn't expect at all. But again, two examples, but they sort of
Sort of a futures market in computer science, human, biomass, right?
Just one other thing to look at while you're there is Art Academy of San Francisco, I think it's called, which is just a weird, wild, private university. I mean, I've never even heard of it. It's got 20,000 students. I couldn't believe what I was
let's see if I can hold on to mine long enough to remember it. There was I think it was an answer to the question about is it going to take and blowing the whole thing up, or is it going to happen, kind of phasing. I suspect we're going to see examples of both. In fact, I think we're already seeing it. That with the public institutions especially, the fact that the legislatures nationally are changing the funding model, it's not just that they're reducing funding, they're also trying to tie it to student success more, which I think is a laudable goal if you actually understand what are true metrics of student success, and that's a big if. And unfortunately, it's being driven by state legislators in many cases who don't know. Yeah. You mean by the accrediting bodies? Yeah. I do, and I think that is going to continue to be one of the great challenges, I think, until that gets figured out.
So, not to make everything we've covered thus far irrelevant in any way, shape, or form, but this is, you always have to preface these kind of comments with that. I don't know if anybody remembers 5 years ago, maybe more, and I know, another qualifier, I know that there's academia and enterprise are two different beasts, but that being said, we're pretty closely related, stepsisters. So I wanted to ask, does anybody remember, the Second Life phenomena, and then quickly after that, the transition to virtual conferences, and everybody was doing virtual conferences in order to simulate the real-life conference experience, and has anybody heard or seen anything about a virtual conference over the past 6 months to a year, and are those prevalent, are those relevant, and will the MOOC become moot, so to speak, right?
That was good.
So what happened, and my answer actually ties to the question I'm going to ask, is those virtual conferences are happening, but they're happening either 1-to-1 or 1-to-5 or 10. So instead of my having to go to a conference, I can go to a session. There's some specialization going on. There's also, and there's lots of them going on. Some of which are free, and some of which are marketing, and some of which are for pay. Not that different than conferences. The other thing going on is I don't need to go to the conference. I don't need to go to TED. I can watch TED. I don't need to go to TED because I can go to TEDx locally and get my mind just as expanded. So I think that's happening, and we'll see the same thing happening here. But that actually tied, let's see if I can actually remember the question I was going to ask yet now without looking at it, but I think I can't. That actually ties to, I'm hearing about Harvard, and I'm hearing about MIT, and I'm incredibly grateful to live in this state and have the benefits that accrue just from living here from you guys. But I'm guessing, and I guess, let me ask you a different question. The folks who are not at those universities, do you have the kind of funds to, for example, do videos for people? Because to me, I'm assuming the answer is no. I don't know. Please.
I would say yes, but. Yes, we can, but on a small scale. And in fact, that's also my answer to the Second Life question. Particularly for us, Second Life, there were faculty who were it was all the rave until they ran into the scale issue. Right? They were hard limits on how many people you could actually have in that one session, which then created the issue. And we have the same problem with what you're describing. There are a lot of things that we know would be good to do, and there are a lot of things that we are already trying to do. But then when the question becomes, well, how can I serve a larger audience, then you start to quickly tally up how expensive that is. So we have enough resources to experiment. What we don't necessarily have is the ability to make the case to build that experiment out to scale.
So that's I thought that might be the case, and so I'm sort of going back to your thing about less is more. There's a huge amount of ways that it seems like IT can be helping with that. So, for example, may I borrow your phone for a second? these do an awfully good job of doing those videos. And I guess I'm coming back to what I thought you had laid out as an original theme, and maybe I misunderstood it, but it's how does IT flow into this? And maybe that's our lunch discussion. I don't know.
Well, yeah, thank you for the theme, because the theme now is how do we flow into lunch? Because Joanne says you're going to have to get their butts out of here and get a meeting, all right? So I'm going to turn it over to you for the quick finish, and then send us to lunch.
Quick finish is thank you very much. We really wanted an open discussion, and we certainly got a lot of things brought up. Now, I think, and I don't know if Joanne, you want me to, I think at lunch Joanne wanted us to talk about models. Business models, is that what you're talking about? And we could also talk about how IT can add value, which we began to discuss here. Do you want to talk about both those things, or? Okay, great. Great. Fantastic. And thanks to the panel. Thanks to the panel.